The name that I wanted to go through in today's session is CapitaLand Ascendas REIT. I know for many REIT holders, CapitaLand Ascendas REIT is one of the more popular REITs in the Singapore market because of the strong sponsor. We have got CapitaLand, and at the same time, we also see that in terms of the distributions, it is one of the names where the distributions have been more resilient over the past few years. Recently, we have seen CapitaLand Ascendas REIT announcing acquisition of some assets. It has also placed up some additional shares. So I wanted to look at this transaction and understand what it actually means for unit holders. Some disclaimers before we start. Today's sharing is for information purposes and is not catered to your individual risk appetite as well as investment objectives. Okay, so we see here CapitaLand Ascendas REIT's share price. Like I mentioned earlier, it is one of the REITs where we have seen the share price being more resilient. In terms of the past few months, there was some pullback after the announcement of Trump's tariffs. That led to a significant sell down across the entire market as well as for the REIT sector. Since then, we have seen a recovery in CapitaLand Ascendas REIT's share price to now about $2.65 per share. Okay, so the acquisition that I wanted to talk about would be two assets in Singapore. One would be 9 Tai Seng Drive, and the other would be 5 Science Park Drive. Okay, so both of these assets have a strong occupancy rate. They are modern assets which were recently completed in 2019. And with the acquisition, CapitaLand Ascendas REIT would strengthen its footprint in the Singapore market. So we'll spend a bit more time to understand these two assets. The first is 9 Tai Seng Drive. So this is a data center asset in Singapore. And in terms of the acquisition cost, it is at 464 million Singapore dollars. Okay, what is worth noting is the occupancy rate. We see here a 100% occupancy rate, a weighted average lease expiry of 4.4 years. So that provides some visibility on the leases in the coming year. Next, we've got 5 Science Park Drive. For those of you who stay in the western part of Singapore or maybe go by AYE fairly often, you might have noticed this asset. So this is actually an asset that is occupied by Shopee. We see here the total acquisition cost is at about 261 million. And for this asset, we see a 100% occupancy rate as well. So in terms of why CapitaLand Ascendas REIT wants to acquire these assets, we see that the manager has actually attributed a few reasons. Number one, increase the footprint in the Singapore market, enhance the quality of its portfolio, be able to get a steady income stream from established tenants. The acquisitions are expected to be accretive to the distribution per unit and has further potential organic growth opportunities. Okay, so first and foremost, we see that both of these assets are in Singapore. And with the acquisition, CapitaLand Ascendas REIT's total portfolio asset value would increase from 16.9 billion to 17.6 billion. Okay, and what we see here is that in terms of the contribution from Singapore, it would increase from 11 billion to 11.7 billion, which means that CapitaLand Ascendas REIT exposure to Singapore would then increase to 67%. Okay, so for investors who are preferring REITs with Singapore-based assets, what this means is that for CapitaLand Ascendas REIT, now we have close to 2/3 of its entire portfolio that is based in Singapore. Apart from the Singapore assets, if I were to look at CapitaLand Ascendas REIT's portfolio breakdown, the remaining geographies where it has exposure would be Australia, US, as well as in UK, Europe. What we also see from this acquisition is that CapitaLand Ascendas REIT would increase its exposure to data centers from 1.4 billion to 1.9 billion. We've got close to 1 billion that would be Singapore data centers, which would represent 54% of its entire data center portfolio. So if you like data center exposure, it is worth noting that with these acquisitions, CapitaLand Ascendas REIT is able to further increase its data center exposure, particularly in the Singapore market. So, what are some of the benefits of this acquisition? We see that for both of these assets, they provide stable income streams from established tenants. So for 9 Tai Seng Drive, it is fully committed by end users in the digital, e-commerce, as well as financial services space. And like I mentioned earlier, the weighted average lease expiry is 4.4 years. So that provides the visibility on the rental income in the coming years. For 5 Science Park Drive, we have got Shopee, which is one of the largest e-commerce platforms in Southeast Asia as well as in Taiwan. And that, once again, would be something that provides revenue visibility on, particularly since Shopee is using this space as the regional headquarters. Apart from the visibility on the current leases, what the REIT manager has also mentioned is that there is scope for the rental income to grow further from here. So using 9 Tai Seng Drive as an example, the REIT manager believes that there is scope for potential rental uplift by comparing the current retail rents versus the potential rents that they believe they can get. So looking at this example, they believe that there is scope for the rents to go up by up to 30% by comparing the current versus the potential rents. Why is there scope for the rental uplift? Overall, we see a tight vacancy rate in the Singapore data center market of about 2%, given the supply constraints. If you were to look at 5 Science Park Drive, likewise, the REIT manager believes that there is scope for rental uplift of about 15% when the lease actually expire. This is because the existing rent that is being paid by the tenant is about 15% below the comparable market rent around the area where this asset is located. So overall, the REIT manager believes that these acquisitions will actually lead to an accretion to the distribution per unit. So looking at 9 Tai Seng Drive as an example, the expected accretion to the distribution per unit is at about 1.24%. The expected accretion for the 5 Science Park Drive acquisition is at about 0.14%. So adding both up, the expected accretion is expected to be at about 1.36%. So to be able to fund the acquisition, CapitaLand Ascendas REIT has completed a private placement. This was actually done last week, and initially the issue price was expected to be between 2.465 to 2.515 per new unit. What we saw here is that the demand was fairly healthy. The private placement was eventually 4.1 times subscribed. So what was the eventual issue price of the new units? The placement has been completed and it was done at $2.47 per new unit, with a total of about 202 million new units that were being issued. Okay, so if I were to look at this $2.47, this is actually at the 5.2% discount to the volume weighted average price of about $2.60 per unit on 27th of May, which was actually prior to when the placement actually took place. With the 202 million new units that were issued at $2.47 per new unit, the total gross proceeds from the private placement would be about 500 million Singapore dollars. And this would help to fund the total acquisition, which would be at about 700 million, with the remaining actually being funded by debt. So if I were to look at the valuation of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT at this point in time, it is trading at 1.16 times price to book, which is above the historical average. You might be wondering, where can I find the price to book charts of various REITs? And I just want to be able to show you where I usually get this valuation charts of the Singapore REITs. So to be able to get the valuation charts of the Singapore REITs, I will come to the Beansprout website, where we have the insights on Singapore REITs, stocks, bonds, as well as ETF. You can actually search for CapitaLand Ascendas REIT, and on this page, you'll be able to gain access to various information, including the latest price charts, some of the key latest developments, and more importantly, like I mentioned, the valuation charts of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT. So like I mentioned earlier, the price to book valuation is now at about 1.16 times. And from what we see here, it is actually above the historical average as well as the sector average. For many investors, I'm sure dividends would be something that we keep a very close lookout for. So this is something that I can get on the Beansprout website as well, in terms of the historical dividend yield, the historical payouts. They would all be shown on this page. So what I'm interested to now find out is whether the dividend yield of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT is higher or lower compared to the historical average. So what I see here would be that the current dividend yield is 5.7%, and that would be in line with the historical average dividend yield of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT. So we have looked at the price to book valuation as well as the dividend yield chart of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT, and what many investors are often keen to find out would be also whether analysts have a positive view on the stock. So I can come to this site once again, and then I can actually try to find out what is the average market expectation of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT. So what we see here is that the consensus share price target is at about $2.88. And this is actually about 10% above CapitaLand Ascendas REIT current share price of $2.61. Of course, I wouldn't just be basing it on the consensus share price target. I would also be doing my own analysis to understand the fundamentals of the REIT, as well as whether it fits within my portfolio. So to me, it's always important to understand what are some of the key drivers of individual REITs if you want to be investing in them. So here I'll summarize some of what I see as the positive drivers of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT and what are some of the risks to be keeping a lookout for. So to be able to sum up this acquisition, we see that it will increase CapitaLand Ascendas REIT's exposure to Singapore, particularly in the data center segment. So if you believe that the data center market will continue to grow, if you're looking for REITs with more assets in the Singapore market, then that would actually increase CapitaLand Ascendas REIT's appeal, given the increase in exposure through this acquisition. Next, we also see that the assets are occupied by established tenants with scope for further rental growth, given that the current rents are actually lower than what the REIT manager believes are the rents that it can eventually get when the leases are due for renewal. Next, we saw that the acquisitions are expected to be accretive to the distribution per unit of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT. Next, in terms of what I'll keep a lookout for, in terms of what may make CapitaLand Ascendas REIT look less attractive, is that even though the acquisition is expected to be accretive to the distribution per unit, the accretion is actually fairly modest at below 2%. And when we were to compare it to some of the other acquisitions made by other REITs, then it is actually lower or less significant. So taking the acquisition made by 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝗀𝗃𝗃 REIT of 2 data center assets in Singapore as an example, the expected accretion from that acquisition was actually more than 10%. If you want to find out more about 𝗕𝗲𝗃𝗃 REIT and this acquisition of 2 data center assets, you can look at one of the previous YouTube videos where I shared more about this acquisition. We also looked at the valuation of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT, and this is where we saw that the price to book valuation is actually above the historical average. At the same time, when we look at the dividend yield of CapitaLand Ascendas REIT, it is just in line with the historical average. So for those investors who are looking for REITs where the price to book valuation is below the historical average, where the dividend yield is actually above the historical average, then CapitaLand Ascendas REIT may then not meet this criteria. So I hope you found the sharing on CapitaLand Ascendas REIT helpful. We really appreciate if you can like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you can get the latest updates whenever we share our latest insights on the Singapore market. Lastly, if you'd like to get more insights on the Singapore market, do subscribe to our various social media channels as well as visit our website, growbeansprout.com. Thank you for joining us today.